Hi, Brian. Recent news coming out of Canada's auto sector that Honda is pulling out of a $15 billion electric vehicle plant in Ontario.
Another blow to the Canadian auto industry. There are reports Honda is indefinitely suspending plans to build a $15 billion electric vehicle plant in Ontario.
Doug Ford is a jobs disaster. He is not doing what he needs to do to keep auto jobs in Ontario.
Honda just walked away from a $15 billion plan to build electric vehicle factories in Ontario. The largest foreign investment in Canadian history, gone. Honda indefinitely suspended its plans for a $15 billion electric vehicle complex in Ontario, a project that was supposed to create 1,000 manufacturing jobs and produce 240,000 vehicles a year by 2028.
If this was the first auto job loss that we were talking about, then I would say the ball is really in Carney's court to deal with this. But it's not. We've had over the last 4 or 5 years, Oshawa, Brampton, Ingersoll, Alliston, Oakville, tens of thousands of job losses in Ontario's auto sector.
Let us start with exactly what got cancelled. The value chain included a vehicle assembly plant and battery plant in Alliston, Ontario, as well as another factory and a battery materials facility at undisclosed locations across the province. Honda stated it has determined that an indefinite suspension of the value chain project is appropriate at this stage. Indefinite. That is corporate language for done. They are not coming back.
How significant of a loss is this to the sector?
Well, the auto industry in Canada is under extreme pressure right now for a few reasons. Of course, we have ongoing trade uncertainty with the United States.
And Honda did not just cancel Canada. They cancelled their entire EV strategy globally. Honda's global CEO Toshihiro Mibe held a press briefing in Tokyo, confirming the company posted a $2.7 billion loss, its first ever full-year loss, in large part due to the heavy costs of its EV strategy as US president's policies shifted away from EVs by eliminating tax credits and rolling back emissions standards. The American policy environment made the entire EV bet unviable, and Canada had zero influence over any of it.
25% tariffs on Canadian auto exports into the US, our largest market. 90% of our production is destined for the US.
Here is what makes this, specifically, a Canadian government failure. The project was first announced in April 2024 at an event that included then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Ontario Premier Doug Ford, both of whom pledged $2.5 billion each toward the project. Ottawa and Ontario committed a combined $5 billion in support. $5 billion of public money was pledged to this deal. And now, the deal is dead. Politicians used this announcement as a campaign prop, a ribbon-cutting moment, proof that their industrial strategy was working. It was not working. It was a photo opportunity with a price tag.
First of all, when you open up the news about Ontario, any investor like Honda is going to see we don't have the hospital capacity, we don't have the worker capacity, we've got issues with basic public services like transit, we've got a premier under criminal investigation.
Doug Ford knew Honda was pulling back a full year before the final cancellation. When Honda first paused the project in May 2025, Ford vowed to hold auto companies accountable and insisted he was confident Honda would proceed with its commitment. He was not holding anyone accountable. He was performing confidence for the cameras while the deal was already unraveling. Ford had leverage. He had $2.5 billion in provincial money on the table. He used none of it to protect the workers who were depending on those jobs.
Well, Canada had never seen an investment this big in the auto industry before. There were $5 billion of federal and provincial dollars. Now there are questions about whether it will ever move ahead at all.
Mark Carney's response to the final cancellation tells you everything about how seriously Ottawa is taking this. When Honda confirmed the indefinite suspension, Carney called the announcement disappointing and said he believed the shift toward lower emission vehicles was continuing globally and that those are choices of Canadians. Disappointing. One word, Canada just lost the largest foreign investment in its history, and the Prime Minister offered one adjective and then explained that Canadians get to choose their own cars. That is not a plan. That is a shrug.
Honda is reportedly suspending plans for a $15 billion EV plant in Ontario indefinitely. Has the government been informed of this decision, and how do you convince companies to invest here in Canada when there's so much global uncertainty?
Well, thank you for your question. First, we're in constant contact with all the major automakers, in other words, currently producing in Canada.
And this is not the only collapse. It is part of a pattern that Carney and Ford have refused to treat as the emergency it actually is. General Motors ended production of its BrightDrop electric delivery van at the CAMI assembly plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, affecting more than 1,000 jobs. The plant had already temporarily cut production before being fully idled, leaving 1,200 unionized workers laid off. Over $1 billion in government money went into retooling that plant for EV production. The market collapsed. The jobs disappeared. The government set up a response group.
And then, of course, we have a slowdown in the EV transition. Canada witnessed over $40 billion in new investment into this sector since 2020, and a huge portion of that was dedicated to electrification.
Ford threatened to sue GM over the Ingersoll closure. Premier Doug Ford said he was very disappointed by GM's decision and warned the company it must keep its promise to find a new product for the CAMI assembly plant, saying if they breach their contract, we're going to sue them. A lawsuit threat. That is the Ford government's industrial strategy for saving Ontario's auto sector. Sue the companies leaving after you already gave them public money and let the tariff crisis fester for a year without resolution.
I'm not sure I feel the Premier has a plan.
The federal Conservative leader also unimpressed.
What we're seeing from Mark Carney is not a plan, but an illusion.
The Prime Minister didn't mention Honda, but says his government is working with automakers.
And Stellantis joined the exodus too. Stellantis cancelled plans to build Jeep vehicles at its Brampton, Ontario plant and moved that production to Illinois instead. In February, Stellantis also handed its entire stake in the Nexstar EV battery plant in Windsor, Ontario, to partner LG Energy Solution for a nominal $100. Stellantis valued its entire stake in a Windsor battery plant at $100 and walked away. And Ford's government stood there and watched it happen.
Unfortunately, despite very optimistic forecasts about EV uptake, last year we saw a significant decline in EV sales, down to 10% in 2025. That was a fall of 5% or 50% from the previous year. And so that's a challenge. Automakers have invested in this technology, but they're just not seeing the consumer demand. And so
the auto industry's own leadership has now said publicly what the politicians refused to admit. Brian Kingston, president of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, told a parliamentary committee that over 90% of Canadian auto production is destined for the US market. There is no industry without US access, and diversification is simply not an option, because markets in Europe and Asia are better served by assembly plants in those regions. No US access means no auto industry. Full stop. And Canada still does not have a resolved trade relationship with the United States.
most manufacturers in Canada, yes, they build for Canada, but they're largely building here to access the US market. So if demand for EVs does not pick up in the United States, a lot of the investments in Canada that were really meant to service the US will have to be delayed and slowed down.
Canadian auto plant production has declined from 2.3 million vehicles in 2016 to just 1.2 million in 2025. Americans bought 132,000 fewer Canadian-made cars last year, while Canadians bought 62,000 fewer US-made vehicles. Meanwhile, Chinese auto production rose 10%, and Chinese auto exports climbed 21%. So while Canada and the US fight each other, China is eating both of their lunches. That is what Carney and Ford's combined failure to resolve the trade relationship has actually cost this country.
the US consumer decides to make the shift to electrification, that's still a big question mark. We still believe that the industry is heading towards electric long term, but clearly it's going to take a lot longer than initially anticipated.
Honda is actually not even the worst story coming out of Ontario's auto sector right now. It just happens to be the biggest dollar figure. The real story is that this has been happening plant by plant, company by company, for over a year, and neither Carney nor Ford has found a way to stop it. Look at what happened in Windsor. When Stellantis halted production at its Windsor assembly plant, the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association estimated that up to 12,000 Canadian auto parts workers were immediately sidelined. Their CEO Flavio Volpe put it simply, anyone who supplies Windsor and Warren isn't working right now. 12,000 parts workers, on top of the 4,500 Stellantis workers already laid off at the Windsor plant itself. That is one tariff decision, wiping out an entire regional economy in a matter of weeks.
It does provide a lot of employment for the area, right? So it's kind of sad. It's a missed opportunity.
They did delay it. And of course, with everything that's been going on, I'm not surprised at all.
Now look at what Doug Ford's government actually knew and when they knew it. When Ford Motor Company first delayed EV production at the Oakville plant, neither the Prime Minister's office nor federal industry officials were given any advance warning. Premier Doug Ford said he was only alerted of the decision by the automaker early that Thursday morning. Ontario handed Ford Motor Company $295 million in public money, and they learned the EV plan was collapsing from a phone call on the morning of the announcement. That is not a government managing an industry. That is a government being managed by one.
Now, it won't solve the demand issue south of the border, but in Ontario, the Green Party leader wants the government to revive rebates for buying an electric car and add to charging infrastructure to make driving an EV more sustainable.
The Oakville situation alone should have been the wake-up call that forced real action. Over 3,000 Oakville Ford assemblers were laid off during an EV retooling shutdown that began in spring 2024, with promises they would be called back in late 2026 or early 2027. That plan was then scrapped entirely, with Ford executives transferring the projected Oakville EV production to the United States instead. 3,000 workers. Promised a timeline. Watch that timeline get extended, then cancelled, then shipped across the border. And the government that gave Ford $295 million to make those promises stood by while the promises evaporated.
Officially, Honda Canada tells CTV News it has nothing to report at this time.
What conditions, if any, are attached to this deal with Honda, and what is this Premier going to do to fight for those jobs?
Carney's answer to all of this was to scrap the EV mandate entirely and hand out rebates. Carney announced a new program giving rebates to Canadians who buy electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles, repealed the electric vehicle mandate, and replaced it with new emission standards as part of a 5-point plan to transform the Canadian auto sector. Rebates. The Canadian auto industry is losing plants, cancelling billion-dollar investments, and shedding workers by the thousands. And the Prime Minister's answer is a coupon program. How does that rebuild what Honda, GM, Stellantis, and Ford have all walked away from?
Ontario's Minister of Economic Development stresses no money has flowed to Honda.
We continue to have faith that they tell us they're here to stay.
Vic Fideli says it is a trying time for the auto industry.
And the auto executives were already screaming at Carney months before he finally acted. 3 of Canada's top automotive executives sent a warning letter to Carney saying their companies faced extraordinary and unnecessary compliance costs because his government failed to clarify its rules around electric vehicle sales by the end of last year. The companies told him directly, in writing, they were hemorrhaging money because Ottawa could not make a decision on the EV mandate. And he still took months to respond while the uncertainty piled up and companies made decisions to exit.
But But really, if we're going to talk about any referendum, what's happening right now with Honda is a referendum on North America and the stability and predictability of being here. Honda wants predictability in terms of being able to be here for the next 20, 30 years and build vehicles. And right now, we're not seeing that.
Meanwhile, Carney tried to open the door to Chinese EVs as a solution, which sent Doug Ford into a full meltdown. Ford, flanked by automakers and factory workers, urged Canadians to boycott Chinese EV vehicles and support companies building vehicles in Canada. He said opening the door to Chinese electric vehicles risks gutting the Canadian sector entirely. So now Ford and Carney are publicly fighting each other over China, while Honda's $15 billion is gone. GM's Ingersoll plant is dark. Stellantis gave away its Windsor battery stake for $1, and Oakville workers are waiting to find out if their jobs even exist.
You've seen a number of these projects being delayed to deal with market situation. I think it's more reflection about where the electric vehicle market is today.
But with Brampton's Stellantis plant sitting idle, GM ending production of its all-electric delivery van in Ingersoll.
Ontario's own financial watchdog has put a number on where this ends up. The Financial Accountability Office of Ontario projected that U.S. tariffs could result in 119,200 fewer jobs in Ontario by 2026, potentially rising to 137,900 job losses by 2029. Nearly 140,000 jobs by the end of the decade. And the manufacturing sector, which includes the auto industry, accounts for the overwhelming majority of those projected losses. That is not a recession. That is a structural dismantling of Ontario's economic base. The CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association already told Parliament what the bottom line is. Brian Kingston said the future of the industry and the hundreds of thousands of jobs it supports depend entirely on securing Canada's trade relationship with the United States, and that removing the Section 232 tariffs is the single top priority for the entire sector. Remove the tariffs. That is the ask. One ask. And the Carney government has spent over a year announcing rebates, setting up response groups, fighting with Doug Ford over China, and calling Honda's $15 billion cancellation disappointing. The industry needed a government that could negotiate. It got one that could only react.